Hello students, welcome to Epg Pathshala. Today in this module we are going to discuss about climate change and carbon footprint. We'll start with some conceptual clarification on phenomenon related to our subject. We'll talk about sources of carbon, we'll talk about radiation budget of the earth, we'll talk about climate change and greenhouse gas effect, exploring and understanding the problem at both individual levels and international levels through carbon footprint and emission trading. We will explore what steps are being taken to mitigate the problem of carbon emissions through economic devices like carbon trading, its development so far, and what has been India's stand on this. Carbon dioxide is one of the essential gases in the environment and also an important nutrient of the biogeochemical cycle, without which the system would collapse. For the plants to produce food through photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is essential. Carbon dioxide also plays a major role in keeping the earth warm enough to make it habitable. At the same time, excess of CO2 is dangerous to the sustainability of our planet. In this module, we will try to understand why this gas has acquired a central position in the discussions about mitigating climate change. We will start with some conceptual clarifications. We will explore what steps are being taken to mitigate the greenhouse gas effect and greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gas means those gaseous constituents of the atmosphere, both natural and anthropogenic, which absorbs and re-emit infrared radiation. The greenhouse gas basket consists of 6 direct gases such as carbon dioxide, CH4 that is methane, N2O that is nitrous oxide, PFCs that is perfluorocarbons, HFCs that are hydrofluorocarbons, and SF6 that is sulfur hexafluoride. Why is it important to look at carbon? In the explanation of radiation budget, we saw the mechanism through which the surface of Earth gets heated. One of the gases that absorb the terrestrial radiation, that is radiation from Earth, is CO2. There are various other greenhouse gases that absorb those radiations like the water vapor, methane, nitrous oxide. But what makes it come to focus are two things: abundance and residual between the large sources and sinks. What are the sources of carbon? There are several sources of carbon, and below is an illustration of the sources of carbon and also how is the carbon consumed back from the atmosphere into the system. Naturally, carbon was present in the atmosphere, but with increasing human activities like industrialization and constant increase in combustion of the fossil fuels, now we are in a situation where it has led to the excess of carbon in the atmosphere in the form of compounds of carbon. Due to the increasing deforestation, the excess carbon is not fixed and remains in the atmosphere. The remaining carbon in the form of carbon dioxide makes a layer around the earth that traps heat and helps the earth keep warm where there is no source of heat, that is during the night times. The excess of this CO2 would result in trapping excess of heat. More details about this will be explained in the further sections. The radiation budget of the earth. To understand the role of CO2, we need to understand the location and functions of it in the radiation budget of the earth. The energy entering, reflected, absorbed and emitted by the earth system are components of earth's radiation budget. Radiation with short wavelength enters the earth's atmosphere. Major part of it gets radiated back by the atmosphere, but a part of it gets absorbed and trapped by gases in the atmosphere. These are known as greenhouse gases. They emit the absorbed energy through radiation of long wavelength in all directions. A portion of that radiation escapes the Earth's atmosphere, and the remaining emissions heat up the lower atmosphere. This results into heating of Earth's surface. This heating mechanism is known as greenhouse effect, and the gases involved in these processes are called greenhouse gases. So what do we mean by abundance of CO2? CO2 is the second most abundant greenhouse gas after water vapor. The problem is its airborne fraction, which is defined as the fraction of anthropogenic, that is created by humans, carbon emissions, which remain in the atmosphere after natural processes have absorbed some of them. Main reason for this raised quantity is the emission from different sources like industries, power plants, etc. These are human-triggered high emissions scaled up particularly after the Industrial Revolution. This has created an abundance between the sources and sink of the gas carbon dioxide, as the natural sinks where the gas gets absorbed are unable to now absorb the large amount of CO2 that is produced, and as a result it remains suspended in the atmosphere. This is known as the residual CO2 between the sources and sink. The major sinks for carbon dioxide are forests and oceans. The figure below shows sinks and the sources of carbon through carbon cycle. What are the sources and sinks for carbon dioxide? Sources are the point of release of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the major sources of CO2 are: one, combustion, that is burning of fuels that cause emissions of CO2, and second is land use changes. Combustion refers to burning of fossil fuel, and it is a major source of CO2 that gets suspended in the environment. What is the fossil fuel? Fossil fuels are coal, petroleum or oil and natural gas. These are formed from organic material over the course of millions of years within the crust of Earth. The age they were formed is called Carboniferous period. Carboniferous gets its name from carbon, the basic element in fossil fuels. It derives the name fossil due to its formation period and its location under the earth. Fossil fuels are currently the world's primary energy sources. However, fossil fuels are finite resources and they can also irreparably harm the environment. There are different techniques like the carbon capture and carbon storage to tackle this problem. What is carbon capture and what is carbon storage? Carbon capture and storage, also known as carbon capture and sequestration, is a process that collects carbon dioxide that would otherwise be emitted into the atmosphere by industrial and power generating sources and pumps it deep underground for the long-term storage. Carbon dioxide can be captured either pre or post combustion. In integrated gasification and combined cycle power plants, carbon dioxide is removed pre-combustion in the gasification process. In conventional coal-fired power plants, carbon can be captured post-combustion using a chilled ammonia solution, which seizes the pollution from flue gas before it is released into the atmosphere. Individual carbon emissions are called carbon footprints. The governments, decision makers, and businesses have started to seek ways and means to mitigate global warming, aiming at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This brings the need to understand what activities drive greenhouse gas emissions and how they can be effectively reduced. Thus, the carbon footprint became a concept which has now become a popular tool to estimate greenhouse gas emissions related to human activities. Despite its growing appearances and acceptance by media, business houses, and often mentioned by the world leader during the presentations on climate change, the carbon footprint concept has no unanimously agreed definition, usage, or measurement. Origin of carbon footprint can be traced back to the concept of ecological footprint in the early 1990s. Ecological footprint refers to the biologically productive land and sea area required to sustain a given human population expressed as a global hectares. According to this concept, carbon footprint refers to the land area required to assimilate the entire CO2 produced by the mankind during its lifetime. In due course of time, as the global warming issue took prominence in the world environmental agenda, use of carbon footprint became common independently, although in a modified form. The concept of carbon footprint has thus been in use since several decades, but known differently as life cycle impact category indicator global warming potential. Therefore, the present form of carbon footprint may be viewed as a hybrid, deriving its name from ecological footprint and conceptually being a global warming potential indicator. A carbon footprint is a measure of an individual's contribution to global warming in terms of the amount of greenhouse gas produced by an individual and is measured in units of carbon dioxide equivalent. This is a definition that Linus gives in his book published in 2007. Why the term CO2 equivalent is used when we talk about greenhouse gas? Greenhouse gas emissions or removals can be expressed either in physical units such as grams or tons, etc., or in terms of CO2 equivalent, that is, grams of CO2 equivalents or tons of CO2 equivalents, etc. The conversion factor from physical units to CO2 equivalents is the global warming potential of the corresponding greenhouse gas. If X greenhouse gas of methane is to be expressed in terms of CO2 equivalent, then it is multiplied by 21, which is the global warming potential of methane over 100 years timescale, as per United Nations Framework on Climate Change Secretariat. Carbon footprint is made up of the sum of two parts. The direct or primary footprint is a measure of our direct emissions of CO2 from the burning of fossil fuels, including domestic energy consumption and transportation, that is, things like car and plane travels, and the indirect or secondary footprint, which is measure of indirect CO2 emissions from the whole life cycle of products and services that we use, including those associated with the manufacture and eventual breakdown. There is increasing awareness of an individual's behavior or life cycle as a source of global carbon emissions. The calculation of individual and household carbon footprint is a powerful tool enabling individuals to quantify their own carbon dioxide emissions and link these to activities and behaviors. Such models play an important role in educating the public in management and reduction of carbon dioxide emissions through self-assessment and determination. Carbon emission models may possibly be used in the future as a tool to calculate carbon taxes, the allocation of carbon units, and the basis for personal carbon trading. Other terms used associated or sometimes as a synonym of carbon footprint in the available literature are embodied carbon, carbon content, embedded carbon, carbon flows, virtual carbon, greenhouse gas footprint, and climate footprint. While the term itself is rooted in the language of ecological footprint, the common baseline is that the carbon footprint stands for a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are relevant to climate change and associated with the human production or consumption activities. But this is almost where the commonality ends. There is no consensus on how to measure or quantify a carbon footprint. The spectrum of definitions ranges from direct CO2 emissions to full life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, and not even the units of measurements are clear. So the table that you just saw has few different carbon footprint definitions from popular literature. While academia has largely neglected the definition issues, consultancies, businesses, NGOs, and governments have moved forward themselves and provided their own definitions. In the UK, the Carbon Trust has aimed at developing a more common understanding about carbon footprint of a product. It emphasized that only input, output, and unit processes which are directly associated with the product should be included, while some of the indirect emissions, that is, from workers commuting to the factory, are not factored in. A footprint is a measure of the exclusive total amount of carbon dioxide emissions that is directly and indirectly caused by an activity or is accumulated over the life stage of a product. Central concerns, however, remains on the climate change. Climate change and United Nations framework on climate change. There is a growing scientific evidence that burning fossil fuels contribute to rising temperatures and extreme weather events. The impacts of greenhouse gas emitting by burning fossil fuels from human activities are dramatically reshaping the environmental, political, and social landscape and climate change. Climate change means a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. In 1992, at Rio de Janeiro, during United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, which is famously known as Earth Summit, countries agreed on legal binding on the greenhouse gas emissions. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is aimed at preventing global climate change, and it was entered into force on 21st March 1994. The ultimate objective of this convention and any related legal instruments that the conference of parties may adopt is to achieve, in accordance with the relevant provisions of convention, stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interferences with the climate system. Such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. Stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interferences with the climate system. This is the Article 2 of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The second commitment period began on 1st January 2013 and it will end in 2020. The beginning of negotiations to Kyoto Protocol had actually made carbon as a 21st century commodity where carbon footprint and carbon trading concepts gets shaped up. The Kyoto Protocol and the discourses on emissions trading. The command and control and economic incentives have been two major devices that were used in policy making regarding improvement of environment. The command and control approach emphasizes on stringent standards to be followed for abatement of emission, and economic incentives emphasizes on the economic models of taxation based on both production and consumption of emissions, emission charges, and exchanges through tradable units. Kyoto Protocol adopts the EI model for controlling emissions. Adopted in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol is an international agreement linked to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which commits its parties by setting internationally binding emission reduction targets, recognizing the role of economies in the emissions of carbon through their industries and economic model was being devised in a hope to incentivize economies to reduce their emission levels. Kyoto Protocol works on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Through this principle, the protocol puts a heavier burden on the developed nations to reduce and curb emission levels. Following are the categories of parties that are defined by United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change according to their commitment. Kyoto Protocol entered into force in February 2005 and its first commitment period was 2008 to 2012. In December 2012, the Doha Agreement to the Kyoto Protocol was adopted for the second commitment period of 2013 to 2020. The major contribution of this amendment were A. It defined new commitments for the Annex 1 parties, and B. It revised list of greenhouse gases to be reported. The protocol mainly operates through national measures of the parties, that is countries, but has also given the market-based mechanisms in order to meet the target, propagate and encourage carbon emission reductions. Here in the table below, we tell you about what are Annex 1 countries, what are Annex 2 countries, and what are non-Annex 1 parties to the Kyoto Protocol. Have a look. Let's talk about international emission trading now. Applications of a market-based approach in greenhouse gas emission control, particularly carbon, is what is at the heart of international emissions trading. Essentially, it means treating pollution as a commodity. It operates as trading in the pollutants through a cap and trade system. It emphasizes the creation of cap on the emission levels and then treating that cap as a basis for creating permits. It can be seen as a policy instrument to control greenhouse gas emission, aimed at the promotion of operational excellence through existing and new technologies. Clean development mechanism was a mechanism that allowed an Annexure B country to implement a project targeted at emission reduction and then claim carbon credit. Such projects can earn sellable certified emission reduction credits, each equivalent to 1 ton of CO2, which can be counted towards meeting Kyoto targets. Joint implementation. The mechanism that is known as joint implementation, defined in Article 6 of Kyoto Protocol, allows a country with an emission reduction or limitation of commitment under the Kyoto Protocol. And under this sort of joint implementation agreements, the country then earns emission reduction units from an emission reduction or emission removal projects in another Annex B party country, each equivalent to 1 ton of CO2, which can be counted towards meeting its Kyoto target. Parties with commitment under Kyoto Protocol, that is Annex B parties, have accepted targets for limiting or reducing emissions. These targets are expressed as levels of allowed emissions or assigned amounts over the 2008-2012 commitment period. The allowed emissions are divided into assigned amount units. Emission trading, as set out in Article 17 of Kyoto Protocol, allows countries that have emission units to spare emissions permitted them but not used to sell this excess capacity to countries that are over their targets. What is ERU? An emission reduction unit, or ERU, is a unit which is equal to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, calculated using global warming potentials defined by parties to UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. What is CER? A certified emission reduction, or CER, is a unit issued to which is equal to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, calculated using global warming potential defined by parties. What is AAU? An assigned amount unit, or AAU, is a unit that is equal to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, calculated using global warming potential by parties. What is RMU? A removal unit, or RMU, is a unit equal to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, carbon credits relating to land use and forestry. Where does India stand today? Given the socio-economic and geopolitical situation of India, there are huge issues that restrict its commitment for the protocol. There are many initiatives by the government on national level to tackle the climate change in general and emissions in particular. There is a historic argument given by the developing countries arguing that major burden of the emission control should be borne by the developed countries. This argument finds its root in the observation that anthropogenic emissions have steadily increased after the Industrial Revolution, and the developed countries were the main host for the same. Whether or not every country become a signatory of the protocol, the damage that high-paced emissions has done is evident, and future problems can be predicted on the same. There is a larger responsibility at a global level that all countries have to take part in to make sure that we live in the planet which is sustainable, and we hand it over to the next generation with all the sincerity.